London was wrapped in a cold silence the morning it happened. The fog clung low to the streets, softening the sound of footsteps and muffling the distant hum of the recovering city. Buildings still bore the scars of months of air raids, broken rooftops, boarded windows, and walls darkened from soot and flame. But beneath the destruction, London remained standing, not just as a city, but as a symbol. People moved slowly at first, gathering along sidewalks with coats pulled tight and scarves wrapped high around their faces. Children climbed onto lampposts, railings, and brick steps, searching for a better view. Shopkeepers stepped outside and folded their arms, their faces marked by fatigue, yet brightened with curiosity. Word had spread quietly, then suddenly, everywhere. The Americans are coming, not in speeches, not in telegrams, not in promises, but marching boots on the same ground where Londoners had stood alone for so long. For more than a year, Britain had fought with resilience that astonished even itself. Through the darkness of the Blitz, through nights where the sky glowed with fire and the sound of sirens pierced sleep, the British held on, and now helped. Not symbolic support, not distant allies, had finally arrived in flesh and uniform. American troops, thousands of them, crossing the ocean not for conquest, not for territory, not for power, but because something larger than nations was at stake: freedom. And on this day, London would see what that sacrifice looked like. Inside a tall government building overlooking Whitehall, Winston Churchill stood near a window. His cigar rested between two fingers, though it remained unlit, forgotten. His expression was deep and unreadable, as if memory and reality were merging in front of him. He had seen armies march before. He had witnessed ceremony, tradition, and display. But this moment was different. It was not pomp. It was not for applause. It was the meeting of two worlds, two histories, two destinies converging. An aide entered quietly. "Prime Minister, they're here." Churchill nodded once, slowly, and reached for his coat and hat, his iconic silhouette forming before he even stepped into the hall. As he walked, his cane tapped rhythmically against the floor, not out of weakness, but out of presence, the same steady determination he carried through every speech, every crisis, every sleepless night. Outside, the air was cold, sharp, and alive. People whispered as they noticed him approach. Some tipped their hats, others simply stared with the kind of reverence only war can create. Churchill didn't wave. He didn't speak. His eyes were fixed ahead, listening to something faint, distant, yet growing. A drum, soft at first, almost mistaken for imagination. Then another, then the synchronized rhythm of boots striking pavement. The sound grew louder, steadier, stronger. Children straightened. Elderly men removed their caps. Women lifted their chins, holding back quiet tears. The fog parted just enough to reveal the first figures emerging through the gray morning light. Tall silhouettes, uniforms crisp, shoulders squared, faces young but determined. American soldiers. They marched with precision, but not the stiffness of parade soldiers. Their posture carried something different: purpose, strength, youth. Among them were men who had never left their hometowns before this war. Men whose hands had held farm tools, factory levers, books, baseball bats, not rifles. Yet here they were, stepping onto a foreign street for a cause that reached far beyond their borders. As they moved closer, the American flag, bright red, white, and blue, came into view, unfurled in the wind, as if declaring, "We are here, and we stand with you." The crowd didn't cheer, not loudly, not yet. It began with something quieter, a long breath, a collective exhale, a moment where a city that had endured fear, loss, and isolation suddenly felt less alone. Churchill watched them with steady eyes. His jaw tightened, not from doubt, but from emotion he refused to display openly. He had hoped for this moment. He had fought politically for it. He had waited through uncertainty, through diplomacy, through the harsh reality that decisions made oceans away determined whether Britain would stand or fall. And now, before his eyes, the first step of that hope had arrived. A soldier marching near the front glanced sideways, not breaking formation, just long enough to truly see the people watching. His expression softened. He wasn't marching through London as a stranger. He was marching through it as a partner. A young girl, maybe 7 years old, waved a small British flag with mitten-covered hands. Her mother tried to lower her hand, embarrassed, uncertain of etiquette, but the soldier saw, and his lips pulled into a small but unmistakable smile. It was the first smile the little girl had seen from a soldier in months. Slowly, hesitantly, applause began. First, in scattered claps, then spreading, then growing, until the entire street resonated with the sound London had not heard in far too long. Pride, not just British pride, human pride, shared purpose, shared struggle, shared sacrifice. Churchill stepped forward, nearer to the street. The soldier carrying the American flag saw him and without instruction, without rehearsal, shifted posture and lifted the flag higher. A ripple moved through the column, like a wave of silent recognition. Churchill inhaled deeply, filling his chest, gathering words that weren't yet spoken aloud. Then softly, just loud enough for the men beside him to hear, he said, "There it is." A pause. His eyes remained fixed on the men marching with unwavering focus. The greatest partnership of nations the world has ever seen. None of the surrounding officers responded. They knew they weren't meant to. This was not a speech. This was history speaking to itself. Churchill continued, voice low, imminent, almost reflective. "These men do not come as conquerors, but as comrades." He watched their faces. Some looked nervous. Some looked hardened, some looked far too young for war, but all of them looked determined. "They come," Churchill whispered, "not because they were forced, but because they chose." For a long moment, Churchill stood in silence, absorbing every detail: the rhythm of boots, the fluttering flags, the quiet gratitude in the faces around him. Then he spoke the words that would later be repeated, remembered, and written into history books, not as official speech, but as sentiment. "When I see them march, I do not see soldiers alone. I see hope crossing the ocean." The crowd didn't hear the sentence, but somehow, without a sound, it felt like they did. As the Americans continued down Whitehall, the city shifted in spirit. For months, London had been a battlefield of survival: blackout curtains, shelters, ration lines, devastating loss. But in this moment, for the first time in a long time, it felt like a battlefield of purpose. A new chapter had begun. War was still ahead, sacrifice inevitable, but now the fight was shared, not just between nations, but between ideals, tyranny and liberty, fear and resolve, night and dawn. And on this cold London morning, as Churchill watched American troops march past, he knew dawn had finally begun. The march continued through London, the sound of synchronized boots filling the streets like a heartbeat returning to a wounded body. The fog had lifted now, not fully, but just enough for sunlight to cut through in thin golden streaks that landed across helmets, jackets, and faces. It felt almost symbolic, as if the sky itself understood the significance of this day. People were no longer silent spectators. They waved, clapped, and called out words that sometimes caught in their throats before leaving their lips. "Welcome, bless you, boys, Godspeed." A few mothers pressed handkerchiefs to their eyes, moved not only by the arrival of allies, but by the reminder that their sons scattered across fronts and oceans were not forgotten. On the street corner stood a veteran of a different war. His medals rested across his chest, polished, but aged like him. His posture was straight, though time had taken much from his body. As the Americans passed, one young sergeant subtly slowed his pace, offering a respectful nod. The old veteran nodded back, and in that small exchange, the years between wars collapsed. It wasn't one generation seeing another, it was one torch being passed to the next. Inside an office nearby, military staff observed the procession through windows and balcony rails, speaking in low voices. "They're taller than I expected. Look at those uniforms, clean as new snow." Listen to that confidence. But beneath their words was something deeper: relief. For the first time in months, maps didn't feel like tombstones. They felt like possibilities. Churchill remained where he was, arms behind his back, watching intently. His expression carried the weight of responsibility, yet beneath it flickered a fire of renewed determination. He knew that battles were still ahead. He knew the war would demand more loss, more sacrifice, more resilience. But now for the first time Britain was not standing against the storm alone. A young officer approached him quietly. "Prime Minister, the papers are already calling today the turning tide." Churchill didn't respond at first. His eyes remained on the men marching past. Then finally, in his deep and steady voice, he answered, "The tide does not turn because we wish it to. It turns because brave men make it so." The officer nodded, absorbing every word. Churchill continued not as a statement, but almost as a reflection meant for history. "We have endured nights of fire, fear, and sorrow. But today," he paused, his gaze fixed on the passing troops. "Today, we witness the beginning of deliverance." As the troops moved farther down the street, more Londoners gathered pouring out of shops, apartments, shelters, and workplaces. The Americans looked surprised at the reaction. Some flushed red with shy smiles. Others waved back subtly, still keeping formation. One soldier muttered under his breath to the man beside him, "Never thought I'd see this in my lifetime." His comrade responded quietly, "Never thought the world would need us like this." Another line behind them whispered, "My mother would faint if she saw this crowd." A chuckle passed through the column, not loud, just enough to remind them that humanity had survived beneath their uniforms. Not far from the parade route, a little boy stood at the edge of the pavement, his small wooden toy plane clasped tightly in one hand. The paint was chipped, one wing cracked, yet he held it as if it were treasure. He watched the soldiers with wide eyes until one of them, breaking formation, just for a heartbeat, winked at him. The boy's expression transformed. For months he had learned the world through fear sirens, shelters, whispers of loss. But now, "Prime Minister, the papers are already calling today the turning tide." Churchill didn't respond at first. His eyes remained on the men marching past. Then finally, in his deep and steady voice, he answered, "The tide does not turn because we wish it to. It turns because brave men make it so." The officer nodded, absorbing every word. Churchill continued not as a statement, but almost as a reflection meant for history. "We have endured nights of fire, fear, and sorrow. But today," he paused, his gaze fixed on the passing troops. "Today, we witness the beginning of deliverance." As the troops moved farther down the street, more Londoners gathered pouring out of shops, apartments, shelters, and workplaces. The Americans looked surprised at the reaction. Some flushed red with shy smiles. Others waved back subtly, still keeping formation. One soldier muttered under his breath to the man beside him, "Never thought I'd see this in my lifetime." His comrade responded quietly, "Never thought the world would need us like this." Another line behind them whispered, "My mother would faint if she saw this crowd." A chuckle passed through the column, not loud, just enough to remind them that humanity had survived beneath their uniforms. Not far from the parade route, a little boy stood at the edge of the pavement, his small wooden toy plane clasped tightly in one hand. The paint was chipped, one wing cracked, yet he held it as if it were treasure. He watched the soldiers with wide eyes until one of them, breaking formation, just for a heartbeat, winked at him. The boy's expression transformed. For months he had learned the world through fear sirens, shelters, whispers of loss. But now, he learned something else. Strength, unity, hope. He lifted his toy plane as high as his arm allowed, as if offering it to the sky. Churchill's car was waiting for him, but he did not get in yet. Instead, he continued walking, slowly along the path parallel to the troops, his pace unhurried, his steps deliberate. He overheard bits of conversation among the crowd. "They came all the way across the Atlantic. Look how young they are. War shouldn't need them, but thank heaven they're here." Churchill's jaw tightened, not at the words, but at the truth behind them. He knew what war demanded. He knew the price of waiting, the cost of refusing evil, the consequences of hesitation. These young men marching through London were not symbols. They were sacrifices in motion. But they marched not with fear. They marched with resolve. Finally, Churchill stopped walking and allowed himself a long breath. A reporter approached him, not intrusive, but reverent, notebook in hand. "Prime Minister," he asked softly, "what do you make of this moment?" Churchill looked at the young journalist, someone who had likely seen more destruction at 20 than most men would see in a lifetime. Then he turned his eyes back toward the Americans and said slowly, firmly, "History will remember this day as the moment the world stood together." The reporter wrote every word, but Churchill wasn't finished. His voice deepened, his tone shifted, and his next sentence became one of the most repeated observations of the era. "When I see these American troops marching through London, I know without doubt that tyranny will not prevail." The pen paused. The crowd stilled. Those nearby heard him. Some gasped softly, some nodded, some whispered, "Amen," because those words did not describe a military march. They described a promise. The Americans continued, passing Big Ben, passing Parliament, passing the last curve of the route where the final spectators stood waving and applauding. At the end of the march, a military band struck the opening notes of a melody that drifted through the air like a prayer. It wasn't British. It wasn't European. It was American, recognizable instantly. The Star-Spangled Banner. The anthem echoed across war-torn buildings, through broken windows, across rubble, and into the hearts of thousands. Londoners stopped, removed hats, lowered heads. When the final note faded, silence followed, not empty silence, but sacred silence. Then slowly, softly, quiet voices began singing in return, like a reply carried through generations. God save the King. Two nations, two anthems, one cause. When the final soldier passed, and the echoes of boots softened in the distance, Churchill finally exhaled. His gaze remained fixed on the emptying street, not seeing absence, but legacy. He turned to an aide and said gently, "Once, we stood alone." He paused. Then, with emotion held deep beneath gravel and resolve, he added, "Today, the free world marches beside us." And with that, Churchill stepped into his car, not as a man retreating from ceremony, but as a leader stepping toward the future. A future no longer marked by isolation. A future strengthened by unity. A future worth fighting for. London woke to a different kind of morning. On the day the American troops settled fully into their roles on British soil, the night before had been loud with celebration, pubs full, voices singing, laughter echoing against old brick, and the clinking of glasses, symbolizing something greater than camaraderie. It was hope alive, reborn, finally audible again. But now morning light softened the memory. The city was quieter, calmer, reflecting rather than celebrating. The air held the smell of coal smoke and morning mist. And once again, the bells of St. Paul's tolled slow, deep, timeless. Somewhere in that silence, Winston Churchill prepared for a speech. Not just any speech. A message meant for history. A message inspired by what he had seen only hours earlier. American soldiers marching through a war-torn capital with heads high, boots steady, expressions young but determined. A message that had settled deep in his mind like a spark waiting to become a flame. As his aides organized papers and adjusted microphones, Churchill paced. His hands were behind his back, his head slightly bowed, as if he were speaking with ghosts before speaking with the living. He stopped suddenly, lifted his head, and whispered, almost to himself, "Yesterday saw the future of this war walking down a London street." Meanwhile, across the city, American troops adjusted to their new surroundings. Some wrote letters home telling mothers they were safe, telling sweethearts they were still thinking of them, telling friends back in the States that London was cold, old, and oddly beautiful. Others polished weapons, checked gear, or simply sat staring at buildings that had stood for centuries. Buildings older than the nation they came from. There was awe in that realization. One private from Texas looked at Westminster Abbey and said with a shy grin, "Places like this don't exist where I'm from. We don't got history this old." A British soldier beside him smirked and answered, "You're here now, so now it's your history too." That sentence lingered, because this war, terrible as it was creating something the world rarely understood until much later. Shared identity. Not American, not British, not Canadian, not French, not Polish, not any single nation. Something larger, something rising from sacrifice, something earned in fire. As Churchill entered the broadcast room, Technicians nodded respectfully. Radios across the world waited. Quiet rooms in London, noisy barracks in the English countryside, ships crossing the Atlantic, and even families in America, who were just waking or preparing breakfast, would soon hear his voice. He adjusted his glasses, set his notes before him, and took a deep breath. The microphone in front of him was old, polished, almost ceremonial because through it, history had traveled before. The red light blinked. Silence hung. Then, Churchill spoke. His voice carried strength, warmth, and emotion restrained under discipline like a storm contained, but not diminished. Yesterday, he began, I walked the streets of London and saw the stars and stripes waving above our battered city. I heard boots firm, confident boots marching across roads still bearing the scars of war. He paused, letting the image settle in the minds of millions. And in those marching columns of American soldiers, he continued, I saw not just men, I saw resolutions. I saw youth unbroken by darkness. I saw allies not forced, not obligated, but united by belief. His tone deepened. I have always known that freedom has friends, even in its darkest hour. But yesterday, I saw those friends arrive not as distant promises, but as flesh and blood. Across London, both British and American troops were listening. Some stood still, some subtly straightened their posture, some swallowed hard, feeling emotion rise not as sadness, but as pride. Churchill continued, let no tyrant imagine that he faces a weary foe. Let no oppressor assume that democracy stands alone. Because yesterday, on the streets of London, I witnessed something extraordinary. His voice grew quieter, more intimate, more powerful. I saw America move not with hesitation, with bravado, but with purpose. The kind of purpose that changes wars. The kind of purpose that reshapes history. Then came the line the world would quote for decades. The new world has arrived armed, resolute, and unwilling to let the old world fall. Silence followed. Not empty silence, heavy silence. The kind that travels through hearts before minds. After the broadcast ended, there was no applause in the recording room. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because everyone present was absorbing the weight of those words. Churchill removed his glasses, leaned back slowly, and allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He knew speeches did not win wars, but speeches could strengthen the people who fought them. Words could become armor, and sometimes, they could become destiny. Later that afternoon, Churchill traveled to a field camp, where American and British soldiers trained together. For the first time, the air was filled with movement, men jogging, instructors shouting commands, boots pounding earth, metal clinking, engines roaring. But beneath the noise was harmony taking shape. Two cultures different in accent, tradition, and temperament were learning to fight as one. A British sergeant barked instructions. An American officer echoed them differently. The rhythm wasn't perfect yet, but it was forming. Churchill watched with hands clasped behind him, his hat low, cigar lit. A young American officer approached him nervously. Sir, he said. Permission to speak? Churchill smiled. Son, he replied. The day I silence an ally is the day this war is lost. Speak freely. The officer took a breath. We won't let you down. Churchill studied him, his youth, his sincerity, his fire. Then he placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and said, You haven't come here to avoid failure. You've come here to achieve victory. And together, mark my words, we shall. The following weeks revealed something extraordinary. British civilians and American soldiers began forming friendships unexpected, sometimes humorous, sometimes deeply meaningful. Children followed American troops, fascinated by their uniforms. Women thanked them with tea, scones, and cautious, but warm conversation. Older men, veterans from another war, watched them march with quiet approval, perhaps remembering the battlefields of 1918, where Americans had once come before. One elderly gentleman approached a group of soldiers and said, voice trembling, we survived the last war because you came. And now here you are again. The Americans didn't know what to say, so they simply stood with him, silently acknowledging the weight he carried. Meanwhile, German intelligence intercepted news of the American arrival. Reports warned Berlin that Britain was no longer isolated, that the United States, with its factories, carriers, tanks, and millions of soldiers, was now in the European theater. One German general reportedly muttered, "We have awakened a giant, and it has crossed the ocean." Those words spread through the German command with a mixture of frustration and grim realization, because the war had changed. Not later, not eventually, but the very moment American boots touched British soil. One evening, Churchill met with General Eisenhower and several commanders to finalize planning for future operations. Maps covered long wooden tables, radios hummed, papers rustled under tense hands. Eisenhower leaned forward and pointed at the map. "Once we build strength," he said, "once we are ready, we're not just going to defend, we're going to take the fight back." Churchill exhaled slowly, not out of doubt, but out of the gravity of what was being spoken. That, he replied softly, is the sentence Europe has been waiting to hear. As winter approached, London changed again. American trucks rolled past stone cathedrals. British and American flags flew side by side. Christmas lights flickered among sandbags and air raid shelters. Around fires and bunks, soldiers shared stories not of war, but of home. One night, in a dim barracks filled with the soft sound of boots being unlaced and rifles being oiled, an American soldier from Chicago quietly asked a British soldier from Portsmouth, "Do you think we'll win?" The British soldier didn't hesitate. He pointed toward a photo pinned to the wall, Churchill standing with American troops that first day, and he answered, "We didn't believe victory was possible, not until you arrived. And now we do." Months later, long after D-Day, long after victory began to seem more certain than impossible, Churchill revisited that memory the day American troops marched through London. He would later write, "When I saw those young Americans walking through bomb-scarred streets, I knew that we would not only endure, we would prevail. Because sometimes history doesn't change slowly. Sometimes it shifts in an instant. With marching boots, with shared purpose, with unity born from necessity, hardened by sacrifice, and strengthened by hope." So what did Churchill truly feel that first day? Not just relief, not just admiration, something deeper, something timeless. He felt the moment the war stopped belonging to fear, and began belonging to resolve. He felt the moment two nations different, distant, but bound by belief, stood together not as allies of convenience, but as partners in destiny, and the world would never forget it.